Excellent. All right. I appreciate the delay there. Like I said, we're going to be talking about eero for business. We're going to be going through over a couple of different items and kind of how it pertains to installing it whenever you are selling it, specifically the eero PoE gateway. So we're going to be talking about eero for business as a whole, just talking about a brief overview on eero for business itself, kind of what all comes with, the value propositions, just high level informational so that we kind of understand what it is that goes into this product. We'll also talk about some setup best practices. So that way, whenever somebody's decided that they want to turn around and purchase a PoE gateway that has the eero for business subscription on it, we can kind of understand, or we can kind of give some basic guidelines so that way they can understand how to set everything up and have a really great experience right out of the box. And then, of course, afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about how troubleshooting within the app makes everything really, really easy, so that way we're able to seamlessly move from one topic to the next, or one issue to the next, without needing to have a networking background, so that way you can easily identify whatever's going on. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a training slide if there wasn't a question slide at the end. So whenever we're talking about eero for business, the main thing here to keep in mind is that, over the last several years, we've really made our name through our residential background, right? That's always kind of been our bread and butter. But it's not just about residential, right? We're able to now help across all different commercial sectors. So we're able to help with, small, medium businesses, for example, and new construction areas, and trying to make sure that we've got everything supporting wired topologies. Of course, we can always install in residential as well. But here we're going to talk a little bit more about that commercial side, that eero for business side. Eero for business, the idea is to take all of the things that made eero so popular, right? Being able to have that really seamless, easy installation, not needing to have a networking background to understand exactly how to set up a network or how to manage your network or even change your Wi-Fi name. Things as simple as that. For some people, it might come off, it might be something that you never really realized, but a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of users never change the default network name for their Wi-Fi access point, right? They'll use whatever the service provider provided, or whatever the default that was written on the box. Being able to make changes like that and really customize their setup to meet the needs of the business, really, really important. So we've taken all of those really great ideas and thrown it into the business setting, right? So the idea is that we can set something up. You can have a reliable network without needing to have managed a whole staff of IT dedicated to being able to support the project, right? If you've got 3-4 employees because you're a really small business, you don't really have the overhead to be able to have dedicated IT, right? So being able, as the owner, to be able to have a network, easily be able to manage it yourself, despite it not being your area of expertise, really, really important. Also allows us to set up a great experience for users and for guests, right? So a guest can come in, be able to get free Wi-Fi, be able to have that great captive portal experience. It provides the logo for the business, a great branded experience. It can also set up terms and conditions, so that way people are able to make sure that they agree to your terms and conditions before joining that guest network. And then, of course, the big thing here is being able to have access to multiple SSIDs, or multiple networks. So that way I can have my network segmented not only for those guests and those visitors, but also for my staff, right? Maybe I need to have a separate network for my point of sale system, right? Or maybe I need to have my, the books and everything that I'm using for payroll and inventory and stuff like that on a separate network from the one that my regular employees are using. Or I want to have a network dedicated just to being able to use IoT devices. We're able to set that up really easily with eero for business. So let's talk about that last one a little bit more in detail, right? So with eero for business, you're able to get 4 networks, 4 SSIDs, 4 Wi-Fi networks. There are kind of several different types with kind of pre-designated ideas behind them. Obviously, you can mix and match and use however you please, but the main idea here is that you've got your primary network, right? The main network. This would be your regular network if you weren't using a business network, or you were just using a standard router. That's really going to be the one that maybe you or trusted employees or something like that are going to be able to use to be able to access anything else that the business is going to be on that main local network. We can also separate out a separate business network, again, so that way we could have some employees connected to one network, others to another network, or I can have everybody connected to one network, and then my point of sale system is on an isolated network to help improve security, right? We can also do a IoT network where we can automatically prevent devices from being able to access anything else on my local network. So that way, if I've got a smart thermostat, and that smart thermostat gets compromised, it's not able to reach or see anything else on the network. It can't reach my computer that's handling all of my payroll and everything like that because it's completely isolated. And then we also have that guest network. This can be a standard guest network. It can also do that captive portal for that really branded customer, really seamless customer experience for whenever people are trying to join in. If you got a coffee shop or something, being able to provide free Wi-Fi is really important. One of the other benefits that eero for Business comes with is eero Insight. Insight is an absolutely powerful tool. It's a wonderful tool for being able to easily understand what's going on at a deeper level, right? You'll still be able to use the app. The app looks very similar to how it does for regular residential users, but you get this extra level of access so that way you can easily identify potential issues, or if you're trying to troubleshoot something, you get more granular, detailed information, so that way you can try to isolate and fix problems fast. Again, Insight's really tailored to be easily read and understood by anybody, not just somebody with a networking degree. So everything's tried to be presented in as plain English as possible, so that way you're able to troubleshoot and isolate issues as fast as possible. Whenever we're talking about that visitor experience, right, we're able to have that captive portal login. So whenever a guest comes into your shop, they can see that you're providing free Wi-Fi. There's no password on there. They click on that network and it gives them that captive portal. It shows the brand logo of the business, right? And they get to put in their information and stuff like that, hit the join, and then they're able to get that free free internet. And that entire time it's been branded as part of their business's experience. So that way customers can help keep that business in mind. We can also make sure that we can upload custom terms and conditions. So that way, if we need to make sure that we have those legal T's and C's covered, businesses can upload those. So that way we can present those to the customer, and the customer can agree to those before connecting to the network. Now, all of this sounds great. How can I turn around and sign up for this? There's a couple of different paths for standard users, right? If they weren't purchasing through Wave, they would have to turn around and buy compatible hardware, and then they could purchase it through retail at a hefty $299 a year, right? There's also some other situations where they could get it through a variety of different means, but the vast majority of people would be having to pay that $299 a year. If they're purchasing through Wave, they're purchasing through you directly. If they purchase an eero PoE gateway, that license is going to be included with the hardware right there on the spot. They don't have to put any additional money down on it, and they don't have to do any configuration in the app to switch over from a residential to a business network. It's just the second that you plug it in, it's immediately a business network. It immediately has that subscription added. That being said, we do have a list there at the bottom of the screen that kind of shows a list of compatible eeros. So if they're going to be using other eeros, right, obviously they're going to want to have some Wi-Fi. They can mix and match any of these eeros together to try to build out that business network. I expect for a lot of businesses in this case, you'll utilize the PoE gateway, probably a couple of PoE 6s in the ceiling, so that way they can, have great Wi-Fi everywhere and have them all mounted in the ceiling. If they don't have access to be able to run cabling through the walls, though, Max 7 is another great option for making sure that we can have, the best experience, the fastest speeds as possible. Now, since the subscription that I was talking about is tied specifically to the PoE gateway, I wanted to touch on the PoE gateway for a minute. PoE gateway is an absolute monster. It is a wired only device, so it doesn't broadcast Wi-Fi itself. But what it does have is it has two 10 gigabit Ethernet ports, which means that we can support ISP speeds up to 9.4 gigabit per second. And then we also have 8 2.5 gig PoE++ ports, meaning that we could supply up to 90 watts to a single client. We actually have a total power budget of 100 watts, meaning that I can plug in multiple, PoE access points, PoE cameras, whatever I need, so that way I can get the network up and running, all through the centralized kind of networking hub at this point. While it doesn't broadcast Wi-Fi, it does still support Zigbee and Thread. It uses Bluetooth for the initial setup. So we're able to, if they had Zigbee or Thread or Matter devices, they could still connect those through the Alexa app to directly to the PoE gateway. PoE Gateway also has an optional 1U shelf. So if we're going to be putting this in a rack mount installation, they can also purchase a first-party shelf if they would like to, so that way they can have it securely mounted. For these installations, I suspect a lot of people are going to be using that PoE 6. So I figured I would talk about it for a moment. PoE 6 is a great all-rounder. It is a 2x2 antenna. So we got the 2.4, we got the 5 gigahertz. Vast majority of devices these days are going to connect on that 5 gigahertz 2x2 antenna. It is a Wi-Fi 6 device, so 802.11ax. And it has 2 Ethernet ports on it. We're going to have one 2.5 gig port. That's going to be our PoE port. So that's the one that we're connecting to power the eero typically. We also do have an additional 1 gigabit per second port that we could use if we needed to, hardwire a wired client device or something to it, because we only had one drop or something. We can use that if we need to. It can cover up to 2,000 square feet per unit, and typically is rated as supporting about 100 devices. Now, you don't want to have 100 devices all running a speed test at the same time, but if you've got up to 100 devices, throughout the office, kind of sprinkled random IoT devices, stuff like that, we can be able to support that. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Max 7. Max 7 is kind of our top of the line right now. It is a tri-band Wi-Fi 7 device. It's a 2x4x4 antenna array, so we can connect tons of client devices on this thing, up to 200 client devices. Same caveats that I just talked about before. But the big one on this is because it's Wi-Fi 7. We're able to utilize much faster speeds on this thing. You can get wireless speeds up to 2.5 gigabit per second on a single client. You can get up to 4.3 gigabit per second if you happen to have a 4x4 Wi-Fi 7 client device. There aren't really many of those out there, but the speed between the two Max 7s communicating with each other does utilize that, meaning that their backhaul between two eeros is running at a whopping 4.3 gigabit per second, which is really wild. It also has two 10 gigabit per second ports. So again, we could support those ISP speeds up to 9.4 gigabit per second, as well as two additional 2.5 gig ports. So that way, anything that we need to hardwire into this guy can get the fastest speeds possible. Just like the other one that I was talking about before, does have that Zigbee radio, the Thread radio, Matter compliant. I can connect any of those smart devices through the Alexa app without any issues. With all of our eeros, so including the ones that we've already talked about, plus all the ones that were on that little chart that I showed you before, they all come with free automatic updates. There's no license that they need to pay. There's no recurring costs that they need to pay for those updates. We will just support those devices out of the box with free continual updates to make sure that we're getting the best performance as possible, constant security updates so we can keep everything as secure as we possibly can, as well as occasionally we might even have new features that launch where we can retroactively improve the experience that people are getting with the specific product. Any questions on any of that before we move on to setup?
Hey, there was a question in the chat from Paul, said, can we turn off the 2.4 band as well as change the channels when we use the gateway?
Okay. So for the gateway doesn't have Wi-Fi capability. So we're not going to be, there's no 2.4 or 5 gigahertz to turn off. For any of our eeros that do broadcast Wi-Fi, the main thing that drives that talking point about trying to either turn off the 2.4 or to alter it so that way I can make sure that I can connect a 2.4 only device is really in this like client driven misnomer that devices are incompatible with one band or the other. Any client device can connect to an eero regardless of what frequencies it supports. So if I've got a 2.4 gigahertz only device, I don't need to have a separate SSID or a separate Wi-Fi name to be able to connect it. Worst case scenario, we have a troubleshooting button where we can temporarily disable a 5 gigahertz band so that way we can get the phone that's running the smart app that's trying to get this, light bulb or whatever to connect on down to the 2.4 band, but afterwards, 5 gigahertz comes back on, device is going to connect just as it always would. But no, there's no immediate option to disable any one band permanently. Nor are there many situations where that's going to be the best solution for most people. As far as the channels, it's a great question. Eero utilizes what's called ACS or automatic channel selection out of the box. So what's going to happen is I plug in this eero, it's going to boot up on default channels. And then over time, it's going to keep scanning that airspace, and it's going to automatically select whatever the best channel is for that specific use case. So that way, if there is airtime congestion or something that's making one channel not acceptable, we can actively avoid that and move over to another one. And because it's not static, because we're not specifically forcing it to sit on one channel specifically, if things change, a new tenant moves into the building next door, apartment neighbor, whatever moves in, and their new router happens to utilize that channel that we were using, we can automatically switch away from it. So we'll always make sure that we're using the most optimal channel at any given point in time. Good questions. Let me pull up the chat here. Let's talk about setup. So these are just going to be some generic, talking points and understanding points. So that way, if we're getting questions from installers about, how they should best handle installing these products, we've got something to be able to answer those and be able to handle those inquiries. The biggest thing to note here is that obviously there's no limit to how many eeros I can have on a network. If I need 45 eeros to be able to cover my, massive complex, I technically can do that, right? There's nothing in software limiting me from having any number of eeros on my network. However, there are a couple of guidelines that we can use to kind of estimate and help people understand exactly how many eeros really make sense for their setup. So the first one is that within every eero, from one eero to the next, or one eero to whatever client device we're trying to connect, I want to have them spaced out. I want to have something within 50 feet, right? I either want to have eeros within 50 feet of one another, or I want to be at least 50, at the most 50 feet away from a client device, right? So that way I can make sure that I've got really, really great 5 gigahertz overlap throughout the entire network. So if I've got this entire building blanketed in 5 gigahertz coverage, that means that within 50, I could be anywhere within that building. I should be 50 feet away from an eero, right? Ideally, if we're going for the absolute pinnacle of signal strength, I would even move that a little bit closer, go to like 35 to 45 feet, right? Maybe like a 40-foot average, just so that way I make sure that I'm accounting for potential interferers, right? Things like concrete walls and stuff like that are really, really common in business installations, and that concrete can really mess up the Wi-Fi signal strength. And so on the other side of a concrete pillar, the Wi-Fi is going to be a lot weaker. So making sure that we can proactively prevent that, really, really valuable. Also, if I've got multiple stories, right? If this is a multi-tiered business, I want to make sure that at a minimum, I have 1 eero per floor, right? Even if this one floor is just for a single office, right? That's like the owner's office or something like that up this small little staircase. We would still want to have a single eero in that location. So that way we can make sure that no matter where you are in the premise, you have really great coverage, right? And then, of course, as I kind of alluded to earlier, whenever we're talking about making sure that we've got enough eeros to be able to cover the space, we're taking into account any potential interference that the customers let us know about in advance, right? If they know that they've got really heavy concrete, or they've got a really challenging installation setup, or they've got like a whole bunch of heavy machinery between two walls or something like that, we can try to account for that in advance by kind of over provisioning to make sure that we've got enough coverage to make up for these interferers. So let's talk about that for a minute. Here we're going to talk about some placement tips. Again, I mentioned whenever we're talking about connecting 1 eero to another, or 1 eero to a client device, want to make sure that we're within that 50 feet, right? With 50 feet, I'm talking you imagine a string, and that string happens to pass through all the walls and furniture and whatever else happens to be in the premise to connect that client device with that eero, or that eero to another wireless eero, right? The more things that string has to pass through makes that string a little bit more frail. Eventually, that string becomes so frail that it snaps, right? So the name of the game is trying to place the eeros in a position where that string can be as strong as possible, so that way we can optimize our performance and our coverage. So in this example here, I've got a simple office layout. We've got some ceiling mounted eeros, the PoE 6s, and they had cabling going through this part of the office, but they didn't have cabling going to the break room, right? Ended up being an afterthought in this particular installation. Of course, they still want to have Wi-Fi in the break room, so we're going to put a wireless eero in there to try to boost up the coverage in there. Now, a really, really common tactic is going to be to go wherever there's a dead spot and put the eero in that dead spot, or put, that's the place that we're trying to boost out Wi-Fi. And it makes intuitive sense, right? If I've got bad Wi-Fi here, I can put an eero and suddenly that bad Wi-Fi is now good Wi-Fi, right? The problem here is that I'm not getting any I'm not getting great signal from the nearest eero, right? I'm outside of that intended range. I'm outside of that kind of 50 feet for the 5 gigahertz, like I was mentioning, right? If I'm too far away, yeah, I might be boosting out Wi-Fi in this dead spot, but I'm just boosting out junk signal, right? I'm not getting good signal, so I can't repeat out good signal, right? Luckily, a lot of the times whenever I look at these setups, small changes end up making an outsized impact on things. There's, even as something as small as moving it from one wall to another can make a big difference. In this case, there is some overlap on this left-hand wall over here. So if I just move that eero over to the other side of that break room, suddenly I can get better coverage from one of the other eeros, and I've got a more reliable connection for everybody in that break room. So now that way, I'm still getting good signal now in the break room, and I didn't have to do anything crazy. I didn't have to run additional wires. I also didn't have to move that eero outside that wall. This is also a great time to point out that the way that Eero's True Mesh works is that every eero can see every other eero on all frequencies, right? And we can adapt our backhaul in the transmission path as we see fit, so that way we can make sure that we're always getting the best signal possible. So whenever I moved that eero from one side of the wall to a different one, and we switched which eero it was connecting to, I didn't have to do that in software. I didn't have to manually configure anything. The eero checked around, saw that this other eero was now giving a better signal, and automatically switched over. Same thing, actually, if for a fun fact, same thing happens even if I'm hardwired, right? If I'm hardwired and I cut that cable, it's going to immediately switch over and start using Wi-Fi instead. You don't have to configure anything in the app to be able to make that transition happen. Would placement distance apply the same for thick concrete walls? Great question. Thick concrete walls is definitely going to make it to where we need to probably move them a little bit closer. Concrete is just a perfect density to really mess with 5 gigahertz signals specifically. So 5 gigahertz can really get what we would call attenuated by concrete. So either adjusting our placement so that way there's as little concrete between eeros as humanly possible if we're doing a wireless one, or in some cases, if the place is all concrete, there's a impassable wall or something, you might even rather consider hardwiring it. But anything that we can do to try to overcome that concrete wall is going to be really, really valuable. Speaking of Ethernet, I suspect with a lot of these businesses, there's going to be a large amount of use of Ethernet wiring throughout the premise, right? Eeros absolutely can be set up in a hardwired topology, so that way we can make sure that we've got great signal going to each node, help boost out that performance no matter which office you happen to be in. This absolutely works just fine on an eero network. What we typically recommend, let me turn on my little laser pointer here. What we typically recommend is that we're going to have our WAN, be it a modem, ONT, modem router combo, whatever it is. That WAN source is going to be plugged into our gateway eero. That gateway eero then, if this is a PoE gateway, for example, we could then plug all of our other eeros and everything into it, right? But if I'm using a different eero, because any eero can technically be a gateway as long as it has Ethernet ports, if I need more ports for whatever reason, I can absolutely add a third-party switch onto here. My suggestion, our recommendation is going to be that typically we're going to go for and recommend an unmanaged switch. That way it doesn't happen to make any impact on our mesh connection between our eeros, right? Now, if this is an existing setup where they happen to have managed switches already and they're not wanting to get rid of them, we technically can, but we're going to really recommend that we disable items like spanning tree protocol or STP, as well as a couple of other settings I have here on the screen that you're welcome to write down if you think you need. But in general, much easier to just recommend an unmanaged switch for most setups. And as always, anytime that I'm providing recommendations for installers on topology layouts, I always like to keep the KISS steps in mind, right? The more that we can keep it simple, the easier it's going to be for us 2 years down the line to be able to go back out there and troubleshoot things, right? If I have all these cascading switches, I've got random, and I'm using random networking, random closets to be able to add another switch, so that way I don't have to run several more lines. back to the main server room. That kind of stuff really bites you in the long run. So being able to make sure that we keep our topology simple, try to use that star topology. I would rather you use a 48 port switch than use a bunch of cascading 16 ports, just because that happened to be what was on hand, right? The simpler we can keep that setup, the better. Now let's talk for a minute about really large networks. There are going to be some situations where we happen to have lots of switches, right? Maybe we've got multiple 24-port switches because we just have a lot of hardwired client devices, right? And so we need to turn around and have multiple switches. Now, with the PoE gateway, we can make this setup really, really straightforward. What can end up happening if I've got multiple switches and I kind of go from one switch to the next switch to the next switch, and I have them daisy chained, right? Or they're kind of stacked from one to the next, or cascading is kind of the networking term that we use a lot of times. You can end up overwhelming the first switch in that line because it's having to handle all of the communications for downstream switches, right? So there's a couple of things that we can do to make sure that these larger networks are set up appropriately. The first one is going to be that whenever we're using a large network with lots and lots of switches, I'm going to strongly recommend that we keep all of the eeros on the first switch, right? Have that first switch be unmanaged, have all the eeros on there, so that way we can keep that path for our mesh as short as humanly possible. If we're having to travel across a bunch of switches, that can sometimes get a little messy and it's unnecessary, right? Also, self-servingly feeds us back into the simple part that I was talking about before. If I've got a really simple topology and I know everything's connected to the same switch, and I do that on all of my installs, it's really easy for me to go back afterwards and be able to service that. Also, speaking of switches, let's say that I've got an Ethernet line running to an office, right? And I know I need to put an eero in that office, and I also need to put a switch because they've got, a handful of devices that need to be wired in there. We absolutely can totally work with that. My recommendation, though, is that, we'll have the Ethernet cable going to that office. We go from that wall jack to the eero, then from the eero into the switch, right? I would rather you do that than go wall jack to switch to eero, right? Again, that kind of creates that cascading switch thing that we were talking about. It also just adds additional potential points of failure between nodes. So we'd rather just keep that connection line as simple as humanly possible from one eero to the next. That way we can prevent user error where they accidentally unplug that switch and now that eero that's still plugged in and connected correctly is offline for no reason. Also, if we're talking about really large networks where we do have multiple 24-port switches, multiple 48-port switches, whatever, if we're trying to avoid that whole cascading switch thing, we can also plug, the SoC on the eero PoE gateway can be a lot faster. The processor on that gateway is a lot faster than the processors that are on a lot of those switches. So being able, even though it's not specifically designated as a aggregation switch, we can still plug each individual switch onto one of the 8 2.5 gig ports. So that way we can kind of treat it as a pseudo aggregation switch. So that way we can put all that overhead on the PoE gateway and instead on those switches, which may not have, again, as powerful of a processor and as much headroom to be able to handle those types of requests. Any questions on that before we get on to the last section? I see here. Can I have a third-party router? Yeah, absolutely. You could. There's nothing stopping you from turning around and using like a third-party router, Netgear, Cisco, whatever suits your fancy on that one. You would want to make sure that all of the topology things that we were talking about before, right, of having one eero in front of all of the others, we still want to make sure that that's true, even if they're using a third-party router. The only thing here is that if we want that other router to be handling all the traffic, we would need to move the eeros into bridge mode. Again, really easy to do either through the app or with an insight. It's a one-click affair. That way we can turn off our ability to route traffic, and then we're just providing that Wi-Fi and that mesh connectivity. Any other questions before we get on? All right. Let's talk about setup. For setup requirements on this one, there's a chance that for some of the installers that are setting this up, they might be utilizing our eero for Pro installers program. With these ones, because this is going to be a business setup and because we're using these PoE gateways, it's going to be a little different. So this one is going to be something that we're going to want to call out with that audience. In these ones, whenever we're setting up the network, we're going to recommend that they use the customer's eero app instead of their eero app, right? The end user or the business owner is going to download the eero app and make the network from their account, not from the pro installer's account, right? So that one's going to be really, really important to call out. The other thing is that this PoE gateway, because it has that eero for Business subscription attached to it, it really is intended to be the first eero that's set up on this network to act as that gateway for all the other eeros to connect. If they have existing eeros, or they have an existing network or something like that, we're really going to recommend that they make a new network with this PoE gateway as the head of it, and then they can migrate all of their other eeros onto this new network that we've created. And just for the sake of trying to make everything easy and not run into potential issues, I'd rather you just make a new eero account while you're at it. Just start from scratch, new account, new network, set the PoE gateway up as the gateway on there, and then we know that we're not going to run into potential issues with this. And then, of course, this last point is going to sound obvious, but it's always worth calling out. The PoE gateway is our only eero that we sell currently that doesn't support Wi-Fi, right? It doesn't natively have Wi-Fi out of the box. You have to have another eero connected to it to be able to broadcast Wi-Fi. So if I'm trying to connect wireless devices, or if I'm trying to connect wireless eeros onto this network, one other eero must be hardwired to kind of act as that Wi-Fi bridge, so that way everything else can connect to it. Naturally, once we actually get into creating the network, right? So we've got the customer's phone, we've created the account, we're now making a network, right? The app is going to hold your hand throughout this entire process, but I figured I would just give you a step-by-step instruction so that way we can make sure that we're really clear on it. First and foremost, right, we'll download the eero app on the client's phone. They'll create a new eero account so that way they can access their information. They can either use their phone number, email, or if they have an existing Amazon login, they'd rather use the Amazon login instead, they can do that too. And then from there, the app is going to give you instructions, and I've kind of got this GIF on screen kind of walking you through it. It's going to tell you in plain English, hey, do this, then do this, then do this, right? And you're just going to follow those instructions as you set up this network. Of course, some of those, the high points that I would call out, always make sure that whenever we're plugging our first eero, that gateway eero, into our WAN source, our modem, ONT, whatever, especially if it's a cable modem, we always want to unplug that from power, right? Unplug the old networking equipment, plug the eero into that modem, and then you can plug back in the power on there. A lot of those, legacy cable modems only hand out one IP address to one MAC address once per power cycle. So if you don't power cycle that modem, you can run into a headache. That's, if you've ever been curious, that's why basically everybody says, power cycle the modem is the first step whenever we're hooking up new equipment. So always make sure that we do that, right? Unplug that modem, plug in the new eero, plug it back in, and then we'll follow those instructions in the app. Once the eero has an active internet connection, the next thing it's going to ask is for what you want that Wi-Fi name and password to be. This is going to be for that first SSID, that first network, kind of the main network that we were talking about. Right. Once the initial network is created and that first network is set up, then you'll be able to go into the eero app. If you go over into settings, you go to multi-SSID, you could then configure the other Wi-Fi networks, or that guest network, that visitor network with the captive portal. So that way you can stand that up. By default, it will make a guest network, but it's going to just name it off of the base SSID. Can you reset ports? Oh, great question. Yeah, absolutely you can. On the PoE gateway specifically, I can shut off data to a port, I can shut off power to a port, and I can also toggle the port. So restart it, turn the port off and back on, so that way I can power cycle a PoE camera, or a PoE eero or something like that directly through the app. You can do that through the app. You can also do that through Insight as well. Great question. Not only can I do that with each of those ports, I can also see what's connected to each port as well. So that way, if I need, if I'm trying to go back and service this later, I can see that, I plugged the point of sale system into port 4. Also, while we're talking about ports, I can specify for the main network and the business network specifically, I can change a port to be associated with either of those networks. So if I want one Ethernet port to be used by that business network, say I wanted to hardwire that point of sale system, for example, I can isolate that and make sure that it's on the proper network and not reporting back to the main network. Yes. So the question here was, hey, we've got if we've got pro accounts, if we're using an eero for business setup at this time, it will need to be set up on the client's phone. So it's going to be on their account. And then, if we need to be able to help service them after the fact, that, we can use their phone, or they can, show us what's happening. So that way we can go ahead and troubleshoot after the fact. But it's not going to populate like the other networks on the pro app. And then the last one, I just really wanted to touch on, hey, this is all nice and good. What happens if something goes wrong, right? There's always that anxiety of, hey, I don't have a networking background. This stuff is all smoke and mirrors to me. What do I do if something happens? The app is really good about being able to clearly communicate in plain English exactly what's happening. So if there is something that's going wrong, the app is going to tell you, and it's going to give you steps to be able to remediate it, right? So in this example on the screen, it shows, hey, we couldn't find an eero device, right? And it's going to ask you basic stuff like, hey, did you plug it in? Is it blinking blue? Because blinking blue is the light that we use for setup mode, right? So it's going to really make sure and hold your hand throughout the entire process. There's some other ones that it'll give out too, like check eero connection. Let's say that I didn't power cycle that modem and I didn't follow the steps verbatim in the setup flow. It's going to tell me, hey, we're not getting a WAN connection, and then give you viable steps to make sure that we get that WAN connection. Or if I'm setting up a wireless eero, right, and I put that wireless eero too far away from the nearest eero, it'll say, hey, let's try moving it. This eero's got pretty weak signal. We should move it a little bit closer. So it's going to make sure that by the time that installation is complete, you've got a fantastic service, so that way you can feel confident leaving that installation that everything's going to work consistently out of the box.
Hey, and Gary's question was, are they able to transfer that if they set it up on their device? I do remember we talked about that at one point in time. Is that in the works and just not ready yet, or?
I don't. With my role being what it is, I don't know exactly everything that's in the works or in progress as far as like upcoming features and stuff like that. I know that for residential networks, absolutely, you follow that process of, hey, I create the network in my pro app and I transfer it to my customer, and now me and the customer are able to manage everything. These business networks at this time is just a little bit different, where we're going to set it up for the customer on their app first, and so that'll be how they will manage it for the time being. But I don't have the. If there was anything in the works, they probably wouldn't tell me anyways.
All right. Hey, Lance, since I know that and Adil, I guess either one of you guys, we've talked extensively about being able to manage this remotely for the customer on the dealer side. Is that something that's in the works, or do you guys have any insight on that we can share?
Hey, Donnie.
Yes, sir.
So that is something we want to do. Unfortunately, we haven't integrated on the business side yet. And I don't have a timeline. It's definitely something we want to do because we offer that on the professional side for the pro channel. Just stay tuned. It's something that we want to do. We just are nowhere near getting that complete just yet.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
You?
It looks like there's 2 additional questions in the chat that I'm not familiar with.
Okay. Do you have any partnerships or open API for OVRC to be able to set up and control them, since we can't add them to our eero? There's not a active open API or anything like that that's going to automatically populate that information. That being said, from my understanding with the OVRC, for example, theirs is an integrated separate portal that you would go to the IP address of that switch or that device to be able to pull it up. There's not any built-in navigation where we would be able to see through Insight what's happening on their equipment. We would just be able to see that their equipment is plugged in and be able to see its MAC address, IP address, link rate, all that kind of stuff that you would typically get from a network view over perspective. Last one was, can you add network users onto the business account? Ooh, that's a great question that I don't know off the top of my head. Rajesh, are you here by any chance?
Yeah, I think we can confirm after the call, but I believe you should be able to add network admins to the network.
Perfect.
Awesome. Any other questions from the group? Wonderful. Well, I want to thank the eero team and all of you all for joining. Like I mentioned in the chat, these units are now available in the branches, and you can just request them from your Wave salesperson. We'll work on getting some follow-up email communication out to you guys, updating you with information, and as things come up with updates and stuff like that, we'll be the first ones to update you guys. Thank you all for joining. If you have any other questions, you can reach out to your local Wave team or whoever you have on the Wave team to support you, and they'd be happy to get your answers for you. Thank you all for coming, and hope to talk to you guys soon. Thank you, eero team.
Thanks, Donnie.
Thanks, guys.